Hey everyone, it's Jen from You So Much, and today I'm going to tell you about my favorite editing tricks. So one of the things that happens when I write my first draft of any sales page or anything that I'm doing actually, I really just want to get my thoughts down on the page. So I'm just doing some free writing. I'm just writing down my thoughts about what I'm going to say, and sometimes it's kind of elementary. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. Sometimes it's gibberish. Sometimes I'm repeating words over and over, but I'm really just getting down my thoughts on the page, and I'm getting kind of the overall format of what I want to say in the order that I want to say it. So then what I do is I go back and I make it a lot more interesting and a lot more readable by changing some things in editing, right? Some of the basic editing rules that you probably heard are things like, make sure you put in contractions so it sounds like you would sound like when you're talking, or make it much more simple, take out extra words that you don't need, take out the ands. I use and a lot in my writing. So those kinds of things are kind of the basics, but I'm going to tell you about the extra little steps you can take, the tricks, the secrets that not everyone knows about that is going to make it a lot more interesting for your ideal client. So the first thing that I do is I look at the verbs. So the verbs, people, those are the key. That's what makes it really interesting when you have a really interesting verb. So for example, instead of saying walk, say schlep. Instead of saying hit, say slam. Instead of saying pull, say yank, right? These are the kinds of things that make it much more exciting to read. But just make sure that you're using a word that is best for that sentence, right? You don't want to just pull out any word. You want to use the best word that is the most fitting, that fits best in that sentence. And then it also conveys the feeling and the personality that you're trying to convey. Now, along these lines, one of the things that I use a lot, and this is trick number 2, is a thesaurus. Now, I think it's Stephen King who said something like, don't use a thesaurus, don't use any word that you look up in the thesaurus. And I have to say, I completely disagree. The thesaurus has saved me so many times. But the key with the thesaurus is to not just use it by itself. The key is to take that and then let it spur you onto other ideas. So what I generally do is I will write down some of my favorite words and make a word bubble. I don't know if you've ever seen those word bubbles, but you write down your favorite words and then think of other things that are related to that on your own in your head. And if you have to go back to the thesaurus and look up more words that way, that's great. But what you're doing is you're spurring ideas and things that you can use for even metaphors in your writing by doing this, by doing the word bubble, taking it one extra step and not just using the thesaurus. The other thing about the thesaurus, it's a hard word to say, let me tell you. The other thing about that is that you want to make sure you're using a word that people use, right? Don't just use some random word that you would never use or that your client would never use. You want to make sure you're using a commonly used word, or something really interesting that gets attention. I think it's okay to do that too, as long as, again, it's something that's really fitting and descriptive and conveys those feelings that you want to convey. And the other little trick about this is not to use too many. Don't use too many of these interesting words, because then you have a lot of craziness all jumbled together, and that makes it really hard to read. You want to make sure it's easy for the reader to read it and understand what you're saying, but still get their brain going and have them connect different things they haven't connected before. What I do next is I write down the feeling that I want them to have and a bunch of other words that are related to that feeling. So, for example, if I'm a spa and I want my reader to feel really calm, really relaxed, I'll write down other words that are related to that. And again, I go back to making my word bubble because this is super helpful here. So for example, I'll write down things like peaceful and breezy and tranquil and quiet. And then what I'll do is I'll take that and go further and think of specific things, not just descriptions, but things that reminds me of, like a hammock or a cat nap or a cloud. And what I do then is I go back to my page and think, where is it appropriate to fit some of these ideas, concepts, even metaphors back into the copy where it really makes a lot of sense. The next thing that I do is I use idioms. Now, I don't know if you're super familiar with idioms, but this is a really awesome thing to do when you're writing copy. It's especially great for headlines. What idioms basically are commonly used phrases that use a specific word that usually doesn't have this like literal meaning. It's more of like, it's like that saying that your mom used to say all the time, like the birds in your nest agree, right? So what I do is I go back and I'll enter in a word into the idiom dictionary. That's what you do, is you go online, look at the idiom dictionary, and you enter in a word, and then all these other idioms that come up that are related to that word. So for example, I type in the word hot, and things come up like, and by the way, some words have a lot of idioms and some not so much. Hot is one of those words where there's a ton of idioms. So for example, I type in hot and you get things like hot potato or hot air or boiling hot. So there's all these fun words that you can maybe use in your headline or in your copy somewhere. Hot diggity, things that are kind of fun that might make your copy a little bit more interesting. And again, don't go crazy with this because otherwise it just sounds freaking crazy, right? What's cool about idioms too is that they are something that really conveys an image in your customer's head. Then especially if it's a commonly used phrase that everyone's familiar with, it makes them feel familiar with you. It makes them feel like, hey, that's a saying that I use a lot or that my mom used a lot or whatever, right? So the more common, the better, and the more it kind of fits into the page that you're writing, the better also. You don't want to just use something kind of out of the blue that's again, crazy. The other thing that I really like to do is to use the words that you love, you specifically for your brand. Because what they really do is they convey a lot about you and they convey a lot about your personality. And because they're words that you love, it's probably something that's really reflected in your brand anyway. So it makes a lot of sense. And so I always ask my clients, what words do you love? What words do you use a lot? What words are you passionate about? Because then those words are really going to speak to your perfect ideal client. Now, also, along those same lines, here's another tip that I know you've been waiting for because you know I'm going to say it. I say it all the time, and that is to use your customers' words. And this is super important because then they'll really feel like you understand them. The copy speaks exactly in the same way that they would talk, and I mean exactly the same words. And so how do you do this? I highly encourage you to start keeping track of every single word that your customer uses. Keep track of them on customer surveys. Look at the comments that they make on your blog posts or videos. Ask them questions in interviews. Record them if you have to. Start researching other businesses that are like yours and look at what those customers are saying. This is so important because this will help you sell more. Now, the next tip is for you to use a swipe file. And this is something I've talked about before, but this is something that has been really huge for me. And so what I mean by a swipe file is to keep track in a file of words that work. So how do you know that they work? Well, for example, you keep track of the words that your customers use. We just talked about this. So you can keep track of all the words that your customers are using. In fact, the more you keep track of them, the more you realize which words are used more often by your customers. But there are also words that are used often in copy. So if you start looking when you're at the grocery store, looking at the magazines while you're hanging out in line and looking at words that are used often in copy, they're used often because they work. So for example, the title of this video has two words that I use for my swipe file, and that's secrets and tricks. So these are two words that I use a lot in my copy, and the reason I use them is because they work. They work, people. So use the words that work and keep track of those words that work for you. So here's my challenge for today. I'm going to challenge you to start a swipe file. Now, the easiest way to have a swipe file is just to grab yourself a notebook. Something doesn't have to be fancy at all. It can be just like a receipt pad or like one of those little tiny ones that you can keep in your purse or keep in your back pocket. Something you can keep with you easily. You can even make notes on your iPhone if you want. I do recommend that something like, if you're gonna do something like that, like Evernote or something where you can keep it a little bit more organized. But a notebook for me, I love. And what I do is when I think of a word or I see a cool headline when I'm out and about or I see some kind of awesome description somewhere, I write it down in my swipe file. I write it down in my notebook. And so I'm going to make it really easy for you, and I have a free downloadable PDF that has a place where you can do it right now. I challenge you to go right now to the link I'm putting in the description below and download this one sheet Swipe File Starter. What it will do is we'll ask you to write down 3 words for each of the tricks that we talked about today. And then it jumpstarts you for your own swipe file that will really help you talk to your customers better. It will really help your customers understand that you can help make their fantasies come true. And while you're at it, why don't you write down your own 3 words that describe your favorite fantasy, because words make it real. Thanks so much, you guys. I'd love it if you shared your 3 words for your fantasy, or 3 words you love, or any of the 3 words at all in the comments below. And any other thoughts or suggestions are welcome too. Thanks so much, you guys, and we'll see you next time.